My name is Hazel. I am 29 years old, and for most of my life my family has used my silence against me. As proof that I had nothing worth saying, no future worth protecting, no accomplishments worth acknowledging. Last Sunday, my brother Landon stood in front of 60 guests at the Waterford Club in Houston and announced to the room that I was, in his words, still figuring things out. He said it with the particular smile he reserves for when he wants to look generous while landing a blow. He told his fiancée's father, a man whose approval he has been chasing for 2 years, that I had dropped out of nursing school because I couldn't handle the pressure, that I did patchwork repairs on houses for gas money, and that the family was kind enough to let me live rent-free in our late grandmother's old place while I got myself back on my feet. I sat in my chair, I smiled politely, I did not say a word. He had no idea who I was, not the parts that mattered. And he had absolutely no idea that the man he had been name-dropping at every family dinner for the past 18 months, the man he described as his future business partner, the man whose name he said the way you say, the name of someone you're trying in the room, was going to walk through that door less than an hour later, walk straight past Landon's outstretched hand, and reach for mine instead. Before I get there, I want to ask you something. If you have ever sat quietly while someone constructed a version of you that had nothing to do with who you actually are, leave a comment below. Hit like and subscribe if you know what it feels like to be underestimated by the exact people who were supposed to know you best. Because this is that story. Growing up in the Houston suburbs meant my parents worked hard to make sure we looked successful from the outside. My father, Gene, ran a mid-sized HVAC and contracting company. My mother, Ruth, managed the social calendar and the image, which stories got told at the country club, which ones got buried, and which version of our family was presented to the neighborhood. She was very good at it. Landon was 3 years older than me, and from the beginning, my parents treated his future the way you treat something precious and fragile. Every struggle became a lesson, every failure became strategy. He failed his real estate licensing exam twice. My father bought him a new truck when he finally passed on the third attempt and called it a celebration of persistence. When I left my nursing program at the end of my second year, my mother told her book club friends I had a breakdown. That wasn't what happened. What happened was that I sat in a clinical rotation one afternoon and understood, with complete and sudden clarity, that I was training for a life someone else had chosen for me. So I made a different choice. I went to work in construction, real work, hauling materials, learning to read blueprints, understanding how buildings carry their weight. My grandfather, who had built his own home in East Texas by hand with tools he had saved for over 3 years, thought it was the most sensible thing I had ever done. He started teaching me to see property the way he did, not just for what it was, but for what it could become with the right attention. Those years working alongside him were worth more than any classroom I ever sat in. When he passed 3 years ago, he left me the Craftsman house he had owned in the Heights neighborhood of Houston. A small, old, beautiful property that had been sitting mostly empty since my grandmother died. My parents told everyone they were being gracious by letting me live there. They framed it as charity. It was easier for them to tell that story than to look at me clearly enough to tell a different one. What they did not know, what I had discovered over a period of months, through a series of bank notices that arrived at that address, and that I quietly collected and verified, was that my father had taken out a second mortgage against that property 8 years earlier to float the business through a rough stretch. He had defaulted. The bank had moved to foreclose. I used savings I had built through 3 years of restoration and project work to purchase the property at auction before it went to an outside buyer. I cleared the lien. I filed the deed transfer under the name of my holding company. I paid the property taxes and the insurance and the maintenance every quarter without ever telling anyone in my family what I had done. They continued to believe they were doing me a favor by allowing me to stay in a house I already owned. I let them believe it. Patience has always served me better than argument. The contracting years had taught me to see what other people dismissed. I started taking on distressed properties. Small ones at first, then larger commercial spaces that had been mismanaged into vacancy. I restored them methodically and held them long-term, reinvesting everything I earned. By the time Landon had inherited Dad's business and started pitching commercial development projects to investors who barely knew his name, I had quietly assembled a portfolio of 14 properties across Harris County. My company operated under a holding name that meant nothing to anyone in my family. To them, I was still the woman who fixed drywall on weekends and lived on whatever she could scrape together. Landon had spent the past year chasing a partnership with Crane Development Group, one of the most respected commercial real estate firms in Texas, built by a man named Maxwell Crane, who had been developing landmark projects across the state for 3 decades. The name came up at our family dinners the way names only come up when someone wants desperately to belong to something bigger than themselves. Landon said it the way some people say the names of celebrities, with a reverence that assumed the admiration was mutual. He had no idea that Maxwell and I had been in quiet negotiations for 4 months over a commercial land parcel my company controlled on the north side of the city. He had no idea that Maxwell's senior acquisitions director, a man named Felix Drummond, had been trying for nearly a year to identify the principal owner of my holding company in order to move those conversations forward. He didn't know any of it because I had never volunteered it, and because the version of me my family had decided to believe left no room for any of it. The engagement party was held on a Sunday afternoon at the Waterford Club, a private venue in the part of Houston where the money is old enough that nobody discusses it directly. Cora's father, Howard, had built a wealth management firm in River Oaks that had been operating quietly and successfully for 25 years. He was the kind of man who listened very carefully before he said anything, and who rarely said more than was necessary. My parents called me 2 weeks before the party and told me I was expected to contribute $1,800 toward the event. They called it a family contribution, then mentioned in the same breath that it was a fair arrangement given that I was still in the house. I wrote the check and mailed it back without picking up the phone to discuss it further. I arrived in a navy blazer and dark slacks, nothing elaborate. I had no reason to perform. Landon noticed me within 5 minutes. He was standing with Howard and a cluster of Howard's business associates, men in their mid-50s in expensive, understated clothes, and when he saw me crossing the room, something shifted in his expression. The particular look of a person who has identified an opportunity. "That's my sister Hazel," he said, without lowering his voice, gesturing in my direction with his champagne glass. "She's living in our late grandmother's place while she gets herself sorted out. Does some property repair work here and there? Small stuff." He smiled at Howard. "Every family's got one, right?" Howard made a polite, neutral sound. The men around him offered brief diplomatic expressions that didn't commit to anything. I picked up a glass of water from a passing tray and found a chair toward the edge of the room. I did not offer a correction. I did not look back at my brother. He returned to me twice more over the next 45 minutes. Once to tell Cora's aunt that I was still finding my footing and that the family had always made sure I had a safe place to land. Once to mention to a man I didn't recognize that his sister had stepped away from a medical career to try something more hands-on. A reframing of my departure from nursing school that sounded almost respectful until you listened to the tone underneath it. Each time, I sat in my chair and let it land. I kept my face still and my hands loose in my lap. I had been trained by years of this to absorb a blow without showing the impact. Reacting was exactly what Landon wanted. He fed on the evidence of damage. If I argued back, he would call me dramatic. If I left, he would call me unstable. So I chose silence, not as surrender but as the one thing he could never use against me. There was a man at the far end of the room I had recognized the moment I walked in. Felix Drummond was in his mid-50s, with the careful, measured way of moving that belongs to people who have spent decades making significant decisions and have learned to value the distance between observation and action. I had seen his name on enough documentation that his face felt familiar even though we had never actually met. He was the person who had been trying for nearly a year to track down the principal owner of my company in order to move Crane Development's negotiations forward. His team had been corresponding with my attorney. My name appeared on no public-facing document anywhere. He did not know what I looked like. About an hour into the party, I walked to the sidebar to set down an empty glass and refill my water. As I reached across the counter, my phone, which I'd laid face up on the edge of the bar while I used both hands, lit with a notification. A message from my property manager about a lease renewal coming due. The notification sat on the screen for approximately 5 seconds before the display went dark. At the top of that notification was the name of my holding company. Whitmore Holdings. I picked up my phone and turned, and nearly walked directly into Felix Drummond, who was standing just behind me and slightly to my left. I did not know how long he had been there. He was looking at the place on the bar, where my phone had been, with an expression I have only seen on a person's face once or twice in my life. The expression of someone who has just connected two things they had no reason to expect would connect. He looked up, our eyes met for exactly 1 second. "Excuse me," I said and stepped around him. "Of course," he said. His voice was composed, everything else about him was not. I walked back to my chair and sat down. 2 minutes later, from the edge of my vision, I watched Felix set his glass on the nearest table, pull his phone from his jacket pocket, and walk toward the hallway near the coat room without a word to anyone around him. Landon noticed and made a comment to Howard about people who can't put their phones away at social events. Howard gave an absent, polite acknowledgement. I sat with my hands folded in my lap and waited. The next 30 minutes were the most deliberate of the afternoon. The party continued its performance around me. Landon at the center of every cluster, Cora moving through the room with the ease of someone born to spaces like this, Howard watching and measuring everything with the quiet patience of a man who has been watching and measuring things for a long time. Waitstaff replaced empty glasses and cleared small plates. The string quartet near the windows moved from one piece to the next without pause. Felix did not return to his seat. When he came back from the hallway, he stood near the entrance instead, his posture different than it had been before. Tighter, more deliberate, he was watching the door. Landon called across the room once, "Felix, come on back, I was just getting to the north side numbers." Felix gave a vague nod and didn't move. Landon exhaled, turned back to Howard and resumed his pitch. 13 minutes later, the door to the private dining room opened. Maxwell Crane walked in wearing a dark charcoal blazer over an open collar. He was 61 years old, and he had the particular stillness that belongs to people who have long since stopped needing to prove anything to any room they walk into. The guests around the entrance shifted almost unconsciously as he stepped inside, the involuntary reorientation of a room registering a change in the air. Landon saw him from across the floor and was moving before he had fully processed what he was seeing. He covered the distance in something close to a jog, his hand already extended, his voice arriving ahead of him. "Mr. Crane, I had absolutely no idea you'd be here today. This is a real opportunity to connect in person. I was just telling Howard about the project proposal." Maxwell Crane looked at my brother's outstretched hand, with the expression of a person who has walked into an obstacle that does not require acknowledgement. He didn't slow, didn't pause, didn't redirect. He moved around Landon as smoothly as water moves around a stone and crossed the room. He stopped in front of my chair. I stood up. "Felix called me," Maxwell said, his voice low and entirely direct. "I wanted to confirm before we went any further with the Northside conversation. I've been trying to put a face to this portfolio for close to a year." He extended his hand, and when I shook it, his grip held a second longer than a casual handshake, the grip of someone who has understood the weight of the introduction. "It is very good to finally meet you in person." "Likewise," I said. He held my eyes for a moment with the expression of a person who has been handed something he had stopped actively expecting to find. Then he addressed the room, not as a performance, but because Howard was standing nearby and Maxwell was the kind of man who assumed relevant parties should have relevant information. "Miss Hazel runs Whitmore Holdings," he said, clearly without theater. "Her firm controls the commercial parcel we've been working to bring into our North Side development project. My team has been reaching her through her acquisition contacts for nearly a year." A brief pause. I didn't realize until this afternoon that I had been dealing with the principal owner directly the entire time. Howard's expression changed. He managed wealth for a living. He knew what that name attached to, and he understood immediately what it implied about the scale of what he was standing in front of. He turned to look at Landon. Landon was standing 6 feet away with his arm still half raised and his expression, the expression of a man watching a story he has been telling for years become, in a single moment, obviously and completely wrong. The fallout came in stages, the way large things always collapse slowly then all at once. My father chose the final toast of the afternoon to make his announcement. He stood and tapped his glass and waited for the room to settle, a practiced move, the move of a man who has always believed he is owed attention. He spoke warmly about family and roots and giving the next generation a solid foundation. He said that he and Ruth had made a decision that meant a great deal to them, the family house in the Heights, the property that had belonged to his late father-in-law and that the family had been maintaining for years, was going to be signed over to Landon and Cora as a wedding gift, a real home, a place to begin. He looked at me when he said it. The look lasted 2 seconds and it carried everything he intended it to carry. This is already decided, you will not object, your cooperation is the price of belonging to this family. Landon squeezed Cora's hand, several guests applauded. I waited until the applause had faded completely. The house isn't yours to transfer, I said. The room went quiet in the way that happens when someone says something true that everyone immediately understands cannot be walked back. My father's composed expression held for exactly 3 seconds, then his jaw tightened and the mask shifted. Hazel. I have the recorded deed, I said. I have the foreclosure documentation, the auction closing statement, and 2 years of property tax payments filed under my company's name. You took out a second mortgage 8 years ago and defaulted on it. The bank moved to foreclose. I purchased the property at auction before it went to outside buyers. I set my phone on the table in front of him. Already open to the documents I had kept in a secure folder for longer than I wanted to admit. There is nothing to sign over, the property has been mine. The silence that followed had a texture to it. You could feel people deciding whether to look at me or at my father. My mother made a sound that was not quite a word. Landon pushed back from the table hard enough that the chair scraped against the floor. When his voice came, it was high and compressed, the voice of someone who has been running a story under pressure and is now watching it come apart in public. You've known this for 2 years? You sat in that house and let us think. He stopped, restarted. You let Mom and Dad believe they were doing you a favor this entire time. No one was doing me a favor, I said. I was paying for my own home. He turned to Howard. His voice dropped into something urgent and redirecting, the voice he used when he needed to move a conversation to less dangerous ground. This has nothing to do with the development proposal. Those numbers are entirely independent. The project stands completely on its own. Howard raised one hand. He said Landon's name once quietly, the way you say a word when you intend for it to be the last word in the conversation. It was. Felix stepped forward from where he had been standing near the window. He spoke without hurry and without softening, in the professional tone of a person delivering a fact rather than passing a judgment. The North Side proposal included a contingent land acquisition pending ownership verification. Given today's clarification, and given certain irregularities our team flagged during the initial review of the cost documentation, Crane Development will be withdrawing from preliminary discussions effective immediately. The word irregularity settled into the room and sat there by itself. Landon's voice, when it finally came, was barely controlled. What irregularities? You need to define that. What exactly does that mean? Felix looked at Maxwell. Maxwell looked at me. I had nothing to add. Everything that needed to be said had been said. I did not stay to watch the room sort itself out around the wreckage. I had seen the shape of how these things go when they fall, and I had no interest in standing inside it while it finished falling. I said a quiet goodbye to Cora, who took my hand in both of hers and held it for a moment longer than the situation called for, in the way of someone who has just understood something that rearranges a number of other things at once. I nodded to Maxwell and to Felix. I collected my jacket from the coat check without stopping to speak to anyone, walked out through the front entrance of the Waterford Club, and handed my ticket to the valet. The afternoon outside was mild and overcast, the kind of Houston day that feels like the city is in the middle of making up its mind. My phone rang twice on the drive home, my father, then my mother. I let both calls go to voicemail without looking at the screen. I pulled into the driveway of the house my grandfather had built, that my grandmother had filled with 30 years of ordinary Sunday afternoons, that my father had borrowed against and lost and never told a soul about, that I had quietly bought back and kept standing. I unlocked the front door and stood in the entryway without turning on the lights. The room smelled like cedar and old wood, and something I have never found the right word for. The particular smell of a place that has held people who genuinely cared about each other. I walked to the kitchen. I put the kettle on. I sat at the table my grandfather had built with his own hands in 1962, the same table I had eaten breakfast at as a child. The same table he had taught me to read blueprints on when I was 17, and had no idea yet that those blueprints would become the foundation of something real. My family had spent years reading my silence as vacancy. They had looked at my restraint and seen weakness. They had looked at my privacy and seen shame. They had built an entire story about who I was based entirely on what I chose not to say, and they had been so certain of that story for so long that it had never once occurred to any of them to question it. The kettle came to a boil. I made my tea. I sat in the quiet of my own house in the city I had never left, in a life I had built entirely on my own terms, and I felt for the first time in a very long time completely and entirely at rest.